anybody downstairs tonight? Sorry, worship team. Move that a little bit. Well, my name is Matt. I'm glad to be here with you all. I'm excited about tonight and what God has in store for us. I am a big, well, first of all, so like the last 3 times I've preached a sermon, whether here or at a church somewhere, my PowerPoint hasn't worked. And so, oh my goodness. We're going to try one more thing. Anyway, yeah, I think it's working. Maybe not. There's going to be a segment about sexual immorality. I'm excited. So, I'm a big fan of history. I like history a lot. I studied history. And there's a quote. Winston Churchill said, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And that's one of the cool things I like about history is that if you want to understand why you are where you are, you study history. If you want to try to affect where you're going in the future, you study history. You can learn from history, those kind of things. That has become a very real topic in our lives. Lexi and I are going to have a baby in 6 to 8 weeks. Yes, we are excited. And one of the things we talk about is parenting. And how are we going to parent our children? And this is our first child, so we have 0 experience. And so one of the things that we like to do is look at our parents and how they parented us. And we each have different parents who have different parenting styles, and so we can look at their example and make some decisions. You know, raise of hands, has anybody ever said, when I'm a parent one day, I'm never going to do that blank? Yes, there are some things that you look at your parents' example and you're like, you know what, I'm just not going to do that. I was the oldest child, so I was my parents' first go at parenting, and take that for what it's worth, as far as their parenting skills. But they were trying things, and they did some things differently with my younger siblings, and they maybe learned from some mistakes that they made. But there's one thing in particular I can remember about my parents' parenting style that I'm absolutely not going to do. My parents were big proponents of, if it's on your plate, you're going to eat it, whether you like it or not. And that didn't affect me because, as you can tell, I eat just about anything that's put in front of me. But my brother, Marcus, does not. And one of those things, like the bane of his existence, are green beans. And so we would have these standoffs at the kitchen table where my dad would be sitting there and Marcus would be sitting there, and his plate would have everything gone except for the green beans, and they would just like stare at each other. And we'd be gone, we'd have emptied our plates, and we'd be playing, and like an hour would go by. And Marcus would just be sitting there with his fork, messing with it, because he wasn't going to eat the green beans. And my parents would make it. And I was still pretty young at this point. But one day, we're passing out the food and we're eating, and I had come to an age where I started to have some reason, and I looked and I noticed that everyone at the table had broccoli on their plate except for my dad. And I was like, why doesn't Dad have broccoli? And my mom was like, your dad doesn't like broccoli. Whoa. And here I am, like devil's advocate, like, but Marcus has to eat green beans and he doesn't like green beans. This did create a little bit of controversy and I got in trouble. But I saw that. My parents had a stipulation that you were going to eat what was on your plate regardless of if you like it. And I didn't feel it was fair that they didn't have to live up to that same stamping. And so with my child, you will never catch me trying to feed my child tomatoes because I'm not going to eat that. And so I'm not going to make them eat that. This is your first time here, tomatoes and I, we don't know. But that's something I'm going to implement in my life. And I hope that one day, as my child gets older, and I can build a relationship with them, that I can talk to them about things, that I can talk to them about mistakes in my past, that I can talk to them about things that I've done, and I can help them because I don't want them to go through some of the same things that I went through. I hope that I can use my life for that. And I hope that the way I model my life and the things that I do will be an example for them. And that's what we're seeing Paul do with the 1 Corinthians. He's written this letter to them, and he's talking to them about different things that they're going through, and he's asking them to to imitate him, and he's using his own experiences to help them and to encourage them. And today he's going to help them by giving them a history lesson. He's going to use some things that happened to the Israelites as a way that they can learn from some mistakes of their forefathers. And so we're going to study that tonight. I want to pray before we get going on this. God, I just thank you so much for who you are. I thank you, God, that you hear us when we pray. I thank you that you're here and you're with us. And God, I pray that you would just soften our hearts. I pray that you would speak to us what you want us to hear. I pray that you would be at work in this place. And I pray that you would remove Satan and his distractions from here. And I pray that the words that you want spoke are spoken. I pray that I just get out of the way and that you would deliver your message tonight, God. Thank you so much for Jesus and what he's done for us. So in your name I pray. Amen. So, tonight, if you want to open your Bibles, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And we are going to spend our time tonight in the first 13 verses of chapter 10. So I am going to read those to you really quick. And go from there. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people said... Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it was written. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. All right. So, Paul is writing this letter to the Corinthians, and it worked. All right. So he's talking about the Israelites, and he's going to give them this history lesson. He wants to use the Israelites in their life as an example. So we're going to go through a couple things just about who the Israelites were. The Israelites were God's chosen people, and these were the people who were in Egypt. And God grabbed Moses and was like, Moses, I want you to get my people out of Egypt. And so Moses goes to Pharaoh, and they have a bunch of interactions, and Pharaoh keeps saying, no, I'm not going to let them go. And so God sends plagues. And the plagues come, and there's all these different plagues, and each time Pharaoh's like, no, no, no. And finally, we have what is called the Passover. And the Passover is when the angel of death came, and all of God's people put lambs of blood over their doorsteps, or doorways, over the doorways, and it passed over any house that had the blood of the lamb on it. And so those children were saved, but the firstborn of everyone else perished, and Pharaoh finally was like, you know what? Get out of here. You can go. So God's people are free. And then Pharaoh changes his mind. Pharaoh's like, no, I want them back. So he sends his army. And they're trudging along, and they come to the Red Sea. And they're like, oh no, army. And what does God do? God opens the sea. So they walk through. That's pretty amazing. So these people walk through the Red Sea, and then they go out, and they're going to be going to the Promised Land. And God does not send them a map. God doesn't send them a GPS. Instead, he just puts a big cloud in the sky and says, follow this cloud. So they literally are following God in a cloud. And they're in the desert. They're hungry. They don't have anything to eat. So God rains down food from heaven for them, and water comes out of a rock. In a nutshell, that's what happens to God's people. That's the very condensed version. Copyright to me. So all these things happen. These are God's people, and they've witnessed all of these miracles of God. And so this is what Paul's getting across to him, to the Corinthians in the first 4 verses. He says, for I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud. They all passed through the sea, and they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. So he's letting the Corinthians know who these people were. Who were these people? The Israelites. So now we're going to talk about the Corinthians for a little bit. And who are the Corinthians? Who are these people? The Corinthians were a church planted by Paul. So the greatest church planter / discipler is responsible for this church. We know, based on what we've studied so far in 1 Corinthians, because some of them said that they fell to the teachings of Apollos, some fell to the teachings of Cephas, some fell to the teachings of Paul, that they were taught by Paul, Apollos, and Cephas. Probably some of the best teachers you could have ever come to teach. That would be like if you show up here on Thursday nights, and instead of Jason and Andrew and I preaching, you get like Francis Tran and David Platt or Andy Stanley or somebody like that. Maybe these are people I think good and you don't think are good. But anyway, it's like the best teachers you could have show up and they teach you. And so these people are like, we're one of Paul's churches. We've been taught by the best teachers. They're feeling pretty good about themselves. Paul stayed, it says, for over a year and a half with them. So for over 18 months, Paul was there in Corinth. And this is where he reached the Gentiles. The Jews were like, we don't want anything to do with you. And God told him not to go. So he stayed and he preached and he reached the Gentiles there. 2 of the longest epistles in the Bible were written to the Corinthians. Obviously 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians was written to the Corinthians. Okay? And then we know about the Corinthians that they were full of knowledge. They were very smart. They were very wise. They knew all kinds of stuff about God. The similarities between these two groups of people is that they both had some spiritual privilege. They both had a lot of things going on for them that were really good. They were very blessed by God. The Israelites were God's chosen people. They saw these miracles. They saw all these things happen. They saw all this awesome stuff that God was doing in their life. And the Corinthians were these people that had the best teachers. Paul was invested in them. He was modeling discipleship for them. They were very wise and they were smart. They had all this knowledge. And so Paul's warning, in verse 5, he continues, and he says, after he's gotten done talking about the Israelites, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, if I'm thinking about people that have witnessed God do all these amazing things, witnessed God remove them from Egypt, spread the, do all the plagues, the Passover, open the Red Sea, then to hear that God was not pleased with most of these people is pretty confusing to me. To be exact, out of all those people, 1 million total, 2 of them went to the Promised Land. And that was Jonathan and Caleb, or Joshua and Caleb. And these 2 guys were the only ones that God would have been pleased with. He wasn't pleased with the rest of them. And so what is Paul's message for these Corinthians? What is he trying to get at? Well, the overall message that Paul has for these Corinthians is coming out of verse 12. And it says, therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. The NIV says, if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. And what he's saying here is if you think that you've arrived, if you think that you've been so blessed by God, if you think you've reached the pinnacle or the mountaintop, then right then and there you're most susceptible to fail. Paul wants to speak to the Corinthians about their overconfidence. Paul wants to talk to them and share with them the example of the Israelites and their overconfidence to help them from landing and falling in the same mistakes that the Israelites did. Overconfidence, it can be a pretty destructive thing. I like to think of the story of Peter in the Bible. Peter is very bold, and at one point Jesus says, one of you guys is going to betray me. And Peter's like, it's not going to be me. I will literally die for you. I will die for you. And Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times this very day, before the rooster crows. And he's like, no, no way. And Peter was so overconfident that before he even realized that he had denied that he even knew Jesus 3 times. And his overconfidence failed to prepare him for what was going to come ahead. His overconfidence made him unaware of the dangers that lied ahead. And overconfidence also does some other things for us. It keeps us from growing. If we know everything already, we don't really need to learn anything else. Overconfidence can be a stumbling block in that we don't need to know something because we already know it. And so until we become completely discontented with our life, we don't hear or absorb anything that anyone says because we already know it all. It reminds me of a time, and I'm going to use a track analogy because last week Andrew kind of talked about Paul. We had some track metaphors and analogies. But I was in track when I was in middle school and high school. And I may not look like it, but I actually ran the mile. I was like 100 pounds lighter. But anyway, running the mile is like this endurance race. And so it's not a sprint. It's a 4 times around the track kind of deal. And one race, we were there, and the coach was like, I need someone to run the mile, because we wanted to stack every event. We wanted to have as many people in them as possible, because that's the best opportunity to get points. So we're all sitting there, and we need someone to run the mile. And lo and behold, a guy raises his hand. And this guy was a shot putter. And if anyone's done track, the shot putters are the big guys. Like, they're throwing these balls far, and they're not the runners, okay? And everyone's just kind of like, what? And he's like, I can do it. And we're all like, really? He's like, it's just 4 laps around the track, you guys. And so he's like, all right, you can do it. And so we get up to the track, and I'm like, hey, you're gonna want to tie your shoes, dude. He's just wearing tennis shoes and they're not tied. He's like, whatever. He's got baggy shorts on. The rest of us have like these tiny little clothes on and track tights. And you know a guy's a serious runner when he gets up to the thing and he's got a stopwatch right there and he's like getting ready to start his own pace time. Like, there's not enough people taking the time along the side. It's like, I'm gonna keep it on my own watch too. So he gets up there and he's just standing. And I was like, dude, come on, you're embarrassing me. And he's just like, whatever. You guys take this too seriously. And so the gun goes off. And this dude takes off. Like, takes off. And we're all sitting there and I'm just like, what's happening? Because I see the guy who set a stopwatch first and I was like, that's the guy I'm going to try to follow because he's probably the best. And this guy's, I'm going to call him Big John, even though I don't want to say that, but he takes off, like dead sprint. And I'm just like, so I'm running along and he's like getting way ahead of everybody. And I'm just like, okay. And I'm going and we get halfway around the track and he's still way ahead of everybody. And about 3/4 of the way around the track, something happens. He starts to slow down a bit. And so at the end of the first lap, he's in the lead. He's in first place. And he took off. By the second lap, he has been lapped once by everybody. And by the third lap, lapped again, and everyone had finished, and he was the only person on the track. And before he finished the race, he stopped and just walked off. And there were a couple things about this that stuck out. One is that he was very confident at the beginning, that it was simply just 4 laps. I simply just need to run 4 laps around that track. Some other things that jumped out. He had never trained for it. He had no discipline in that thing. He didn't know what to do. He didn't understand what he was doing. He took off at a dead sprint when everyone knows, unless you're like in the Olympics or something, you don't take off at a dead sprint in the mile. And so he was overconfident. And this can cause us to fail at times. And what Paul wants us to do here is not to overestimate our own powers. When we overestimate our own powers, we put the trust in ourselves and not in God. And when our trust isn't in Jesus and our trust is in ourselves, that sets us up for some failure. And Paul doesn't want these people to fail. Paul said at the end of last week when Andrew was preaching in chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, he said, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others I myself should be disqualified." Paul didn't want to be disqualified. And what that meant, the worst thing that could happen to Paul as a believer would be that he was not useful to God. The worst thing for Paul would be that somehow he could not effectively be a minister of the gospel. And so he was self-controlled and he dedicated himself to maturity and to self-discipline. And this is what he wanted to lead the Corinthians in. This is the example he wanted to set for them. And so today he's going to teach us about a people who were not self-disciplined and who were not mature. And because of that, they weren't allowed to be used by God in the Promised Land. That he had to raise up a new generation of people to do his will in the Promised Land because they were no longer useful to him. And the Israelites were the kind of people that would have never thought that. They were very sure of themselves. They were overconfident. And it reminds me of of what Peter says in 1 Peter. It says, "Beware your adversary, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion waiting to devour." He's always there. He's always waiting to attack. And he's always waiting to find an area where you're susceptible to his attacks. And so today, we're going to look at some of those things. Because it's not just Paul that talks about becoming ineffective. When Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about us as Christians being the salt and the light. And he talks about salt bringing flavor to the world. And he says, what good is salt if it loses its flavor? Can you give its flavor back? No. It's of no use. You should just throw it out. And so Paul's desire was that he be used his whole life by God, that he finished the race well, and be used. And he wanted that for the Corinthians as well. And he wants that for us too. And so we're going to look at a couple of these things. And I was talking to Jason this morning, and we started thinking about, do people care if they're used by God? Like, is it your goal to be used by God? Is your desire in life, is your number one priority, is the thing that you're about being used by God? I'm a husband, and like I said, I'm going to be a father here very soon. The number one goal in my life cannot be to give my kids the best life they can have. That's not the number one goal in my life. My number one goal is not to make my wife the happiest woman on earth. That can never be my number one goal. If my number one goal is to be used by God and to serve God, the great news is that all of those other things are going to fall into place. The overflows of our heart, what we're filled with, what we fill ourselves with, are what are going to come out of us. And so if I'm filling myself with God and His Word, and I'm serving Him and dedicating my life to Him, and I love Him above anything else, those fruits of the Spirit, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, all those things, those are the things that are going to pour out of me. And that'll make me a better father. That'll make me a better husband. And so what Paul's saying to these people is, is being used by God the most important thing in your life? Is serving Him? Is being an effective minister of the gospel your number one call in life? Or is it something else? And if you say that's your priority, do you back that up with your actions? Does your time spent reflect what is most important to you? Do the priorities in your life, are they illustrated in your day-to-day life? If someone were to follow you around with a camera, would they be able to determine that serving Jesus with all of your heart is the call of your life? Because that's what we're called to be. We're called to be ministers of the gospel. And that's not just for me or Andrew or Jason, that's for all of us, all Christians. And so he's going to give us this example of the Israelites. And we're going to look at what the source of these sins. We're going to look at 4 sins tonight that the Israelites commit, 4 things that they go through that, as Paul shows us, prevent them from moving on to the promised land, prevent them from being used by God. And the source of the sins is, as you can see in verse 6, it says, "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did." The NIV says it, "Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did." If you're going to look through different versions, King James is going to say lust after, New Living Translation is going to say crave. All these words are talking about wanting something. These people wanted something. And that thing that they wanted, this evil that it's talking about, is worldliness. They wanted the things of the world. And there's an example of this in Numbers 11. And in Numbers 11, they're being fed every day manna from heaven. And they don't like it. They want something different. And so they start to talk amongst themselves and to complain and to grumble. And they're like, "Man, I wish we were slaves back in Egypt, because there we had cucumbers. There we had melons, we had garlic, we had onions." They started talking about how they had fish. And so they would trade the freedom that God has provided them with for a different kind of meal. They wanted to go back to their old ways. And I'm going to read real quick just this segment of Numbers 11. It's going to be 4, 5, and 6. It says, "Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt. That cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, and the onions and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. So what they're saying there is that they trust the world for their provision more than they trust God. Because God was providing them something. And when I look at this and I'm like, man, vegetables were the thing? That was the thing. But what about our own lives? What are the things that we want and desire, that we don't have, that we need to have, that prevent us from giving our total devotion to God? What are those things? Are they as trivial as vegetables? I think so a lot of the times. You really need a certain kind of a car, or a certain kind of TV, or laptop. These are the things that we need, the things that we choose to spend our money and put our time on. And so, the question we ask is who do we trust? Who do we trust? Because this is the issue here, is that the Israelites were so concerned with the things of the world, they wanted so badly worldly things, that they just didn't trust God for their provision. And so that is the source of these four sins that we're going to look at. Ultimately, at the base of it is, do we trust God? Who do we trust? So the first sin is idolatry. And I had to put this picture because I was talking about it with Lexi in the car. And I was like, what's the most popular Bible story with an idol in it? And she was like, the giant bunny one. VeggieTales reference. She was like, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And I was like, that's a good one, but no. It's the golden calf story. And the people, the same people that had seen God do all these amazing things, spread the Red Sea, plagues, all that stuff, they're on the desert, and Moses is going to go on the mountain to talk to God, and he's going to get the law. He's going to get the word of God. He's going to get the truth. And wait here, I'll be back. And a little bit of time went by, not very long, but to them, a couple of days, whatever, and they got a little stirred. They were kind of like, Moses is gone. Who knows if he's coming back? So, let's make a calf to worship. And basically, what they wanted to do is they said they wanted to worship the God that brought them out of Egypt, which is God. And they had seen that God, and they had seen him work. But they wanted to worship him the way they wanted to worship him. And so they built a calf. They built a calf to worship. And if you look at verse 7, it says, "Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." And I did some research on that. The NIV, instead of saying rose up to play, says partook in pagan revelry. And this idea, this playfulness, basically meant a bunch of people got naked and had an orgy. And that's not surprising. Pagan worship, we've talked about the temples to Aphrodite. Basically, you would go and you would have sex. And that's how you worshipped. You worshipped them. There would be temple prostitutes that you would go have sex with. And so these people wanted to worship like the pagans worshipped. And so they built a calf, and they worshipped the calf by doing that. And what it came down to was they wanted a God that let them do what they wanted to do. They wanted a God that they didn't have to be obedient to. And we today certainly are not crazy enough to want that, are we? I was thinking of a conversation I had with Caroline yesterday where some people want to put terms on what the Bible says in regard to what they can and can't do, and they decide that, well, for me in my case, Jesus wouldn't condemn me for me doing it because he wouldn't. That's the deal we worked out. People want to determine how God treats them and how they serve God based on what they want. And so these idols got put up. And today maybe we don't have idols that we worship or idols that we bow down to or whatever. But I found it interesting. I was reading this book, Gods at War, by Kyle Adamant, and in it he tells a story about how he goes east, and he's just amazed by how all the homes, they have like an idol, a statue in the home, and the whole house is centered around the idol. Every room. And he's like, it's just amazing. I've never seen anything like it at all in my life. And he got home from his trip and he walked into his living room and he saw every piece of furniture was centered around one thing in his room, and it was the TV. Every room in the house, everything's centered around the TV. And the idol is anything in our life that we put in front of God. So maybe we don't have a wooden statue at home that we bow down to, but if there's anything that challenges for your devotion from God, it's an idol. And sometimes things in our life that aren't bad become idols. Sometimes Christian service can become an idol. Sometimes your crutch, the thing that gets you by is how well you serve. That's the thing. Sometimes our relationships can become idols, and relationships aren't bad things to have. But that becomes the most important thing in our life. That's what we're devoted to above anything else. Families can become idols. Jobs can become idols. Money can become an idol. Your grades can become an idol. That's the one thing. That's the non-negotiable in your life that everything else submits to. That can be an idol. And so Paul's telling the Corinthians that when you're overconfident, and when you think you've got it all figured out, and you think you've arrived, you're opening the door for some of these possible things to slip in. And one of the things that slips in is idol worship or idolatry. The next thing that Paul's going to talk to them about is sexual immorality. And we could easily just preach a whole sermon on this. I think I did actually earlier this year. But verse 8 says, we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. And there's a story in the Old Testament where they started doing some sexual acts, and they were very displeasing to God, some of this temple festival worship style stuff. And so 23,000 of them were wiped out. God wiped them out. And it's kind of a sobering thing to think that, like, God disdains sexual immorality so much that at one point He took out 23,000 people in one day for committing it. Sexual immorality is a serious deal. And we talked about what this word means once before, but anything outside of God's intended bounds for sex is sexual immorality, is sexual sin. So anything outside of the bounds of marriage between a man and a woman, any kind of sexual act outside of that is sexual immorality and it's sin. And the world wants to tell us a lot of things about it, that it's normal, it's not wrong, it doesn't hurt anybody. But the fact of the matter is that we hurt God when we do it. He created a plan for us. He created a way for us to have intimacy. A way for us to get a glimpse of the intimacy that we can have with Him through marriage. But that's not what we were created for. And so when we sacrifice our sexual purity to meet a desire that we have, it hurts God. It hurts God because if you're a Christian, Jesus is inside of you, and you bring Him into that with you, and it hurts Him. He doesn't want that for us, and that's why He made a plan for us. And some people are called to be single and to never experience that kind of intimacy. But some people are called to be married and to experience that kind of intimacy, and when you are, you take those commitments seriously, and you don't do things outside of your marriage. But those are things that are normal. They're supposed to be normal. We're called to just accept that as the culture doing it, and everyone does it. And that's just not true. And it doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to be true. You don't have to do the things that the world says you should do or you're supposed to do when you're in your 20s or college years. You don't have to, and that's why Paul's telling these people this, so that they can learn from these mistakes. When we practice sexual immorality, we hurt ourselves. Your future relationships, with your spouses, things like that can be hurt. Your relationship with God can be hurt. Standing in different places can be hurt. Your career maybe can be hurt. Different things like that. We hurt others. We take something from them that's not ours to take. We put people in positions that they're not supposed to be in. We abuse things. We use things. We disregard things. And there are ways that we can prevent these things from happening. I read a study by Howard Hendricks, and he's a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. And so he studied 237 instances where Christian leaders in churches had a moral failure. Moral failure is some kind of sexual immorality. And he found the one common denominator in meeting with them and studying them. None of the 237 had an accountability partner of any kind. These were guys that had it figured out. They had arrived. They were spiritual leaders. They were Christians. They were strong. And they didn't have to worry about some of these other temptations. And sometimes our overconfidence is the thing that sets us up for failure. You know, John 10:10 says that the thief comes to kill and to steal and to destroy. I heard it put one time that Satan wants to kill your witness. He wants to steal your joy, and he wants to destroy your life. And sexual immorality is one of the greatest tools he uses to kill our witness. It's hard for someone who leads a church or something to all of a sudden bounce back from one of those kind of moral failures, and that's a witness that's destroyed. Satan has rendered that person ineffective for a time. And so this overconfidence, this cockiness, or whatever you want to call it, arrogance, pride, that we've arrived or we've got it, that a lot of these Corinthians had. Paul said, you need to learn from the mistakes of your past, learn from the mistakes of your forefathers, because these are the things that will set you up for failure. These are the things that Satan loves to see, someone who's vulnerable because they've got it all figured out and he can slip in the door there. The Bible says words like flee from it, run from it. 2 Timothy tells them to flee from sin, flee from your selfish desires, flee from your evil desires. And he wants us to know that sexual immorality can be one of the things that prevents us from finishing well. And we've seen this again and again in the Christian world. Testing God is the third sin that he addresses in this letter, this chapter. He says, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. And I figured Andrew would love this section, the snakes. But what does testing God mean? Testing God means that we push as hard as we can against the edges of our liberty, and we see how much God will tolerate. We ask questions like, what can I get away with? Instead of asking questions like, how much like Jesus can I be? We look at our life and we keep pushing on the walls, and we want to know how far we can go, and instead of looking at how much like Christ we could be. We look at things that we've done, we look at sins that we've committed and say, well, I haven't been punished for it so far, so it must be all right to keep doing it. And then we keep doing it and doing it. And these people kept testing God. In Numbers 21, they keep testing God, and the way that they're testing God is, we're going back to the food issue. They start to kind of challenge God. They're like, man, if you're God and you're really powerful, you could give us a table and some vegetables, right? You wouldn't send us manna every day. You could send us some meat, some flesh. And they start, just day after day, they're like, oh, it's manna again. Okay, well, I mean, I guess if you're God, you could send some birds or something. And so, you know what God did? He sent some birds. He sent a lot of birds. He drowned them in birds. If you thought Alfred Hitchcock was the first one to do birds flying at you, no. He answered that prayer. They tested God. But do we test God? Do we say, you should make it like this for me, God, or I think this should be the way that things go? Do we challenge him? Do we question him? You know, I look at a lot of my younger life, and I think the best way I could describe it is like tightrope walking. I wanted to find out, I was wanting to know, like, okay, so how far to the line, or can I even get 1 foot over the line? Where's the edge? What can I get away with? What can I do and still be good, quote unquote good? And that's just flawed thinking. It's flawed logic. Our call is to pursue holiness. Our call is to be more and more like Jesus each and every day. So as opposed to asking how far this way we should go, we should be wanting to know how far that way can I go. In reality, how close could I live my life to that of Jesus? You know, Paul was someone who each and every day made effort, strove through these disciplines to live more and more like Jesus. And so he could boldly say, imitate me as I've imitated Christ. And can we say the same thing? Can we walk up to people and say, if you want to live like Jesus, you need to live like me? I don't think that's the case for a lot of us. The fourth sin that he addresses is called grumbling. Grumbling. And this literally means complaining. And so I was looking at this list and I was like, craving evil, idolatry, sexual immorality, testing God, and complaining. It doesn't seem like it belongs. It kind of seems like just an everyday thing. We're supposed to complain. It's like it's a routine. I understand all the rest of them being like worldliness, all that stuff, but complaining, it's just an average deal. It's not that big of a deal. People complain all the time. But what complaining says is, God, stop doing what you're doing and do what I tell you to do. When we complain, we tell God that we don't like the circumstances, we don't like the program, we don't like the way He's working in our lives, we don't like this or that. I don't like the situation you've put me in, I want a different one. And this is really a blow struck right to God when we complain, when we grumble with one another. This is a blow struck right to the purpose of God on our lives. He's created each of us uniquely, wonderfully, beautifully made. We're made in the image of God, and He's designed us all for a purpose. And if you're in this room, God has created you for a purpose. There's a purpose for each and every one of you. And He's got a plan for your life, and He wants to use you in wonderful ways. He references us as His workmanship, His craftsmanship, His masterpiece. And He's got a call for your life. And so when we complain to God what He's dealt to us or what He's given us, we're basically telling Him that it's not just some minimal deal, but that we are giving Him our unwarranted dissatisfaction with His creation. We're looking at what God has made and what He has put in place and saying that it's not good enough. And that's a big deal. And that's why grumbling is included in this, because you see, when we're overconfident and we're worried about us and we're prideful, we start to want things our way. We start to want things a certain way. And if things don't get dealt the right way for us, we're like, what's the deal, God? Why didn't this go the way that I wanted it to? And we start to put demands on God and ask questions of God. And this is what happened in Numbers 16. This is what happened. They started to have some dissatisfaction with God and His plan. And there was this guy named Korah, and his job was to carry the Ark of the Covenant. And that was his job, carry the Ark of the Covenant. Well, Korah did not like that. He wanted to do a lot of the other priestly functions. And so he decided that that's what he was going to do. He was no longer just going to carry the ark, and he was going to start a rebellion. And he said that it isn't right, we're all holy to the Lord, we all have a right to come to the Lord, we should all be priests. And you, Moses, and you, Aaron, you're just taking all the authority for yourself, and you don't want anybody else messing with the priesthood because you want to control everybody. Well, we all have to be priests. And so they started a rebellion. They complained, and they complained, and they complained, and they started this rebellion, and Korah and his buddies showed up, and I don't know if anybody knows what happened. The ground opened up, and they got swallowed up. They were destroyed. End of discussion. They complained, they complained, they complained, they griped, they murmured. They wanted more authority. They wanted something different than what God had given them, what God's plan for them was. They wanted more power. They said they had as much right as anybody else, and they demanded these things of God. And they were killed. Almost 15,000 people were killed that day. And they were killed because basically they were ungrateful for what God had given them. And that's a huge part here. Do you show gratitude? Are you grateful for the things that God has done for you? At the very least, are you grateful that although you are a sinner, although you have sinned, that God provided a way for you to have a right relationship with Him? That although you're a sinner and the punishment of sin, the wages of sin is death, what Romans says, that although that is the case, that God sent Jesus, who lived a perfect life and became the perfect atoning sacrifice for your sins, and that through Him, you don't have to face your punishment. Because that's something to be grateful for. And it's a beautiful thing. Now, this is kind of a sobering thing. He's teaching them all these lessons, and he wants them to know this stuff. And he wants them to learn from the mistakes of the past, and he wants them to check their egos at the door and look at their overconfidence so that they can be effectively used by God to minister the gospel. And there's a lot of bad stories there. There's good news. There's hope. The hope is that we don't have to follow their example. No matter what the world tells you, you don't have to rebel when you're in college. No matter what the world tells you, you don't have to go through a stage of your life that you just made all kinds of really poor decisions or that you turn away from God. There is hope. He finishes this passage, sorry, in verse 11 he says, "Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands, take heed lest he fall. No temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." So what Paul tells us here is that we don't have to follow that example. We can learn from it. We can do things differently. Same thing he's telling the Corinthians is what he's telling us. Is that we can learn from those mistakes. We can open our eyes to the devil's schemes, and we can depend on God. Andrew talked last week about self-discipline. And we, like Paul, can dedicate ourselves to spiritual discipline, and we can run the race well. We can devote ourselves to being in his word and to knowing him more each and every day, and we can be devoted to prayer, and we can ask God to help us love better. We can love people better. We can show his love better, and we don't have to turn out like the Israelites did, who were disqualified from their service, who didn't get to go into the promised land and be part of what God's will was for those people. We can be effective, and we can be used by God. And the awesome thing about this is that God knows what we can handle. He knows us. He knows us better than anyone knows us. And he knows exactly what we can handle. Have you ever driven down a road and you come to a bridge and there's that thing that says like tonnage load or whatever? It tells you how much weight the bridge can handle before it breaks. Well, God looks at us and he knows exactly what our number is for that. And he's not going to give us more than that. He knows that. And he's going to give us just enough. And he's always going to provide a way out for us, because temptation is not unique to you. You are not the only person that's ever dealt with this kind of temptation. Jesus himself dealt with all temptation, but there are other people in this world that you can use for hope and encouragement, because you're not alone. Temptation isn't unique to you. It's common to man. Mother Teresa has a great quote. And she said, "I believe that God will never give me more than I can handle. I just wish he didn't trust me so much." God knows what we can handle. And when things are piling up, he wants you to depend on him, because he's going to walk you through those situations. There's a beautiful story. One of my favorite sports stories of all time is John Stephen Akwari. He's from Tanzania. And he's in 1968 in Mexico City. Tanzania. Mexico City Olympics. He runs the marathon. And he's running the marathon, and close to halfway through, his leg starts to cramp up, which isn't great. And because of that, and because of where they were and the number of people around him, there's an accident. And he falls. And he dislocates his knee, and actually one of his bones started to protrude from the skin. And he's bleeding. And a marathon is 26.2 miles. And he took a shirt from the crowd and he tied it around his leg and he kept running. It wasn't really running, actually. It was kind of like a hobble, dragging his leg. And for the rest of the race, he did this. And the final mile of the race is ran in the stadium, so the last 4 laps. And by the time he gets there, everyone's been done for a couple hours. All the rest of the competitors are done. There's not very many people left in the stadium. There's like one news crew. And they come over because they see a man crawling around the track to finish the race. And when he gets there, gets to the end, they come up and they're like, "Why'd you do that? Why did you keep going like that? You could have quit. No one would have faulted you." And he simply said that my country did not send me 5,000 miles to start the race. They sent me 5,000 miles to finish the race. And that's a beautiful message of understanding that we're called to finish well. We're called to persevere. Like Paul said about this race, that it's not merely something that we begin and then just keep to ourselves, that we have a responsibility to God, that we run this race well and we persevere to the end. 2 Timothy 2:15 says, "Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth." His message for these people here was a simple message that don't let yourself be overconfident. When you feel like you've arrived, That's not a good sign, because that's when you're susceptible. So you need to devote yourself to self-discipline, to spending time with God each and every day so that we can run this race well, so that we can finish strong. And if that's something that you need to pray about, those are questions that you need to ask. You need someone to talk to. If you need to set up some kind of accountability in your life, these are things I'd love to talk to you about. Any of us on staff, we'd love to meet with you, to pray with you, to help you along on this journey, because you don't have to do it alone. And if you've never started this race, if you don't know who Jesus is, and if you don't know what He's done for you, I'd love to tell you about Jesus and what He's done for you. They're going to come up and sing a song, and we're going to close our time here together. Be thinking about these things. What has God said to you tonight? And don't leave here without responding to what God has put on your heart. Let's pray. God, I just thank you so much for grace. I thank you for your mercy and your love. And I just thank you for sending Jesus. I thank you for saving us, even though we didn't deserve it. It's nothing that we've done. And God, I pray that you would just work in our hearts. I pray that you would motivate us, that you would use us to spur one another on to love and good deeds, that you would use us as your vessels, God, and that we would run well, that we would finish strong, and that God, you would do great things for us. And I pray that you just work in hearts. I pray that you continue to work in hearts tonight. God, that there are people here that don't know you as their Lord and Savior, that they would come to know Jesus today. Let this be the day. I thank you so much for who you are, and we love you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.